One of the questions being asked and debated a lot today is the question of leadership, especially in the financial services industry, and especially at a time when the reputation and integrity of the financial services industry has eroded considerably around the world. I'm very pleased to be able to speak to an old friend, David Eldon, a career banker all his life, retired as chairman of HSBC Asia Pacific after 37 years in the bank, and today, busy as ever, the chairman of the Dubai International Financial Center, senior advisor to PricewaterhouseCoopers, and advisor to the Korean government as well. I want to ask David to reflect on this whole question of leadership and how he thinks it should and would evolve in the years going forward, but especially in the context of what leadership meant in the time that he was in the banking industry. David, thank you for joining us to answer this very important question. What was leadership? What did leadership mean in the time that you were in banking?
You raise a very interesting question. Leadership has always meant different things to different people, and I think, happily, the world has evolved. I suppose when I first got involved in banking, our leaders, and I actually worked for another bank for 3 years before even HSBC, but our leaders in those days were people who used to wander into the bank maybe a few hours later than the rest of us did, and they would go out and have lunch, and they would read a newspaper when they came back and go home.
Right, and at that time, banking was, come in at 9, leave at 3.
There was an element of that. HSBC, when I got to it, was a little different, and people used to, I suppose, they used to almost accuse it of being run on very militaristic lines. And if you looked at the senior management of the bank, a number of them had been in the military. And therefore, they expected certain standards.
And this was what, 37 years ago?
Oh, this was maybe a little less than 37 years ago.
But that formed the culture.
That was it. I mean, and you knew where you stood. You knew what was expected of you, how you had to perform, and what happened if you didn't perform.
Right. And you spent your time in it, and the business was predictable, and if you spent enough time in it, you walk up the ranks.
Yeah, there was a lot of question of you were promoted, perhaps in the early days, on seniority rather than ability. Now, things like that have moved on, happily. One of my first managerial posts, my regional manager at the time thought it necessary to telephone the office in London before the appointment was announced, just to remind them that I was going to be in charge of somebody who was 4 days my senior. Fortunately, London said it didn't actually matter, so
right.
And I got on very well with the individual anyway. But leadership was reasonably well defined. We've moved on a long way. Many things have changed. And if you look at what has happened in the course of the last 18 months, maybe slightly less, the banking leadership
been
culture
under tremendous
has
fire.
come in for a lot of pressure. I don't think it matters whether you are running a financial institution or whether you're running a car manufacturing business or a shipyard, or in more recent days, a government.
Right.
Leadership is key, and it has, I think, certain characteristics. You need leaders who, and I don't know whether there are lots of courses on teaching leadership.
Okay.
I'm not sure that you can actually teach leadership very successfully.
Right. Being a regimental sergeant major and being a leader are two different things. There's a functional duty, there's the moral duty.
Yeah. I think both my parents were regimental sergeant majors, I have to tell you. So that gives you a clue as to where I came from.
That's right. And why you fit the HSBC culture in those days. Right.
Perhaps. But what seems to have happened is that we've gone through a phase of leadership which seems to have been brought up in some ways on compromise. people are not doing things that are quite right. So, well, it doesn't actually matter too much. We'll let it go because we don't want to be confrontational. Partly because I suppose that if you do get confrontational, say they should be doing these things, you end up in a courtroom somewhere because somebody says, oh, well, you can't do that because you're interfering with my civil rights. You can't tell me to come into the office in such and such a time.
So when did the industry start to change where these commonly accepted practices started to be challenged, to be stretched?
I don't know if you can actually put a time on it. I think you just notice that the leaders themselves over the last few years just seem to have come in with some different, I'm almost reluctant to say standards, but maybe that's what it is. They were so busy over a period of time making money that this became the criteria. The shareholders were clearly important, but managing the people who were working for them, commercial banking, and I know more about commercial banking than I know more about it than I do about investment banking.
Right.
But we were driving people in the branches to sell more products. And in some institutions, it seemed it didn't matter actually how you sold the products, if recent stories are to be believed. It was a question of meeting targets, meeting the demands of shareholders who increasingly were being driven to accept more profit.
But
so you compromise.
Yes, but you know, in the time that you've been in the industry, you started off being a generalist, and you sort of get moved around the organization, and you build your skills that way. Today, you can hardly run a financial institution without having specialists. And then at the leadership level, you're hard pressed to figure out which among your key people understand how the whole thing holds together.
You're getting me on one of my favorite topics here, so this could go on for a very long time. But you're absolutely right.
Right.
I mean, I agree with you totally. People have decided that they needed to specialize. I think the institutions themselves said, we've got to have specialists doing this. When I was running the bank, I needed somebody in a country. This was the way that I used to prefer it. And other banks do things differently. Other people do things differently. I accept that. But I needed somebody in a country who I could pull out and say, what's going on in your country? They didn't have to tell me to the last cent how much the investment bank was making, the insurance was making, the commercial bank was making. But I did want to know what was going on, and I wanted them to know what was going on.
And they needed to think like you, because they needed to have that big picture at the same time, know enough of the roots in themselves. And
if I asked them the same question a couple of times, they did start to think that way. But
right.
But yeah, I think we've lost something by losing the generalists that we had. Now it's not sort of clever and sexy to be a generalist, but I think it's necessary. We need generalists. We don't need people who are absolutely expert in everything. But and I certainly never was, but I knew where to find them when I needed them.
But you know,